Hello and welcome to the Faith Report, and this is today's episode of Spiritual Spotlight. In today's video, I want to take a look at an interesting biblical topic, the conflicting account of Judas's death in the Gospels of Matthew and Acts. So in Matthew 27, we find out that Judas was filled with remorse after betraying Jesus. So he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. He then went and hung himself. The priests used the money to buy a potter's field as a burying place for foreigners. But in Acts 1, Luke gives a slightly different account. He says that Judas acquired a field with a reward for his wickedness, but then he fell headfirst and burst open his middle, spilling out his intestines. So which is it? Did Judas hang himself, or did he fall and rupture his body on the field he bought? At first glance, it seems like two contradicting reports, but when we dig deeper into biblical context and the interests of the two authors, a plausible explanation emerges. Let's start with Matthew. As a former tax collector, Matthew is very attentive to financial matters and legal proceedings. He's the only gospel writer that specifies that Judas was paid 30 pieces of silver. The amount is significant because that's the compensation owed to a master whose slave was gored by an ox, according to Exodus 21. But accepting this payment, the religious leaders unknowingly admit liability for killing the Messiah. Matthew also spotlights what happens to the money after Judas returns it. He provides legalistic details about the priests purchasing the potter's field and how it gets the name. So it becomes blaringly clear that monetary and legal concerns are what was on Matthew's mind. Luke, on the other hand, was a physician by trade. He's more interested in the anatomical details. It's interesting to note that he spends only 2 verses on Judas's betrayal compared to Matthew's 4 verses, but he devotes much more space to Jesus' emotional agony in Gethsemane, noting that his sweat fell to the ground like drops of blood. So when describing Judas's demise, it makes sense that Luke would offer a grisly report about Judas's corpse bursting open and his intestines spilling out. He gives us a gruesome autopsy rather than a legal account. Synthesizing these perspectives, it seems plausible that Judas hung himself as Matthew reports, but at some point his body fell to the ground, perhaps after the rope broke. Sorry about the graphic detail here, but if you know anything about decomposing bodies, not that I do, but you can imagine that if one fell from a certain height, after decomposing for a certain amount of time, it would be quite hard for some parts of it to maintain its structural integrity after experiencing such a traumatic trauma. So when his body hit the ground that was purchased with the blood money, the force of the impact burst open his stomach just as Luke described. The key is not to view these as contradictory accounts, but rather as complementary details that together provide a fuller picture of what transpired. Each author shapes the narrative in line with their own stylistic and professional interests. Matthew emphasises the legal and financial, and Luke highlights the medical and anatomical. But collectively, they affirm the essential point. Judas betrayed Jesus, was filled with remorse, and he died a violent, shameful death. The gospel writers just zoom in on different aspects of the same story. So in the end, seemingly biblical contradictions often dissolve when we carefully consider the wider context, interests, and message of the author. If you like this video, you might also find this one interesting, where I speak about the evidence for the resurrection of Christ. Anyway, I'm interested to hear your perspectives. Leave your comments below.